On the morning of November 15th, 1944, at 0645 hours, Corporal Edward Mitchell crouched in a muddy mortar pit on the island of Peleliu, watching Japanese soldiers mass in the coral ridges 400 yards to his north. At 23 years old, he commanded a four-man mortar crew operating an M1 81mm mortar that most Marine instructors back at Camp Pendleton had told him was designed for sustained fire rates of 18 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. His gunner, Private First Class Raymond Vasquez, had just finished adjusting the weapon's elevation to 45 degrees, the barrel still warm from the previous night's harassment fire mission. The bipod legs were sunk deep into Peleliu's chalky soil, and beside the pit lay stacks of high explosive rounds, each weighing nearly 7 pounds and containing enough composition B to create a lethal fragmentation radius of 35 yards. For 3 weeks, the 1st Marine Division had been fighting across Peleliu's nightmare landscape of jagged coral, fortified caves, and ridgelines that the Japanese had transformed into a fortress more formidable than anything encountered at Tarawa or Saipan. The enemy had abandoned their traditional beach defense doctrine, instead creating a defense in depth that utilized every natural cave and depression in the island's coral skeleton. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the Japanese garrison from his command post deep inside the Umurbogle Mountains, a labyrinth of limestone caves connected by tunnels that offered protection from naval bombardment and allowed his troops to emerge, attack, and disappear before American firepower could be brought to bear effectively. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese tactics on Peleliu represented a fundamental shift in their defensive philosophy. Rather than the banzai charges that had characterized earlier island battles, Nakagawa's forces fought from prepared positions, conserving ammunition and choosing engagements that maximized American casualties while minimizing Japanese exposure to superior firepower. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy possessed stockpiles sufficient to sustain operations for months, with ammunition dumps hidden throughout the cave systems and supplied through tunnels that American forces had yet to map completely. Mitchell's mortar crew had arrived on Peleliu during the initial assault on September 15th, wading ashore at White Beach while Japanese artillery fire churned the water around their landing craft. The M1 81mm mortar had been designed in the late 1930s as a battalion-level indirect fire weapon, capable of delivering high explosive rounds at ranges up to 3,000 yards with reasonable accuracy. The weapon's simplicity was its greatest strength, a smoothbore tube mounted on a circular base plate with a bipod for elevation and traverse adjustment, requiring no complex mechanisms that might fail under combat conditions. The technical specifications reflected careful engineering compromises between weight, range, and rate of fire. The complete weapon system weighed 136 pounds when broken down into its 3 major components: the 44-pound tube, the 45-pound base plate, and the 47-pound bipod assembly. A trained crew could disassemble and move the weapon quickly, making it far more mobile than the heavier artillery pieces that required vehicles for transport. Each 81mm round measured approximately 16 inches in length and 3.2 inches in diameter, launched by a shotgun-style ignition cartridge that detonated when the round dropped down the barrel and struck a fixed firing pin at the base. The propellant charge could be adjusted by adding or removing increment bags, allowing gunners to vary range without changing elevation, a crucial capability when engaging targets at different distances from a fixed firing position. Private Vasquez had spent 6 months at the Marine Corps Mortar School in North Carolina, learning the mathematical relationships between elevation, charge, and range that governed indirect fire operations. The M1 sight assembly included a traversing mechanism calibrated in miles, allowing precise azimuth adjustments, while the elevation mechanism could be set anywhere from 40 to 85 degrees, depending on range requirements and terrain obstacles. Standard doctrine called for sustained fire rates of 18 rounds per minute, a pace that balanced ammunition expenditure against barrel heating and crew fatigue. But Mitchell had discovered during 3 weeks of continuous combat that desperate circumstances demanded innovations that training manuals never addressed. The Japanese position that concerned Mitchell this morning was a reinforced rifle company occupying a series of coral ridges designated Hill 100 on marine tactical maps. Intelligence estimates placed approximately 200 enemy soldiers in the defensive network, supported by machine guns, knee mortars, and at least one 47mm anti-tank gun that had destroyed 2 Marine Shermans attempting to advance up the coastal road. The terrain channeled any ground assault through a narrow valley where Japanese observers could call down accurate fire from concealed positions, creating a tactical problem that conventional infantry attacks had failed to solve despite repeated attempts over the past 4 days. Marine casualties from these failed assaults had reached 97 killed and wounded, numbers that reflected the difficulty of reducing prepared defensive positions without overwhelming fire support. The battalion commander had authorized Mitchell's crew to attempt a saturation bombardment using every available mortar, round in the forward ammunition dump. Gambling that concentrated high explosive fire might suppress the Japanese positions long enough for infantry to advance and clear the ridges with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The mission required firing rates that exceeded anything Mitchell had attempted during training, pushing both equipment and crew beyond their designed operational limits. Ammunition bearers had spent the previous night moving rounds forward from the beach supply dumps, stacking them in the mortar pit until nearly 300 high-explosive shells surrounded Mitchell's position. Each round had been inspected for damage, its fuse checked, and safety wire removed in preparation for rapid-fire operations. The propellant charges had been configured for maximum range, giving Mitchell's crew the ability to reach every section of the Japanese defensive position with high explosive rounds that would detonate on impact and scatter steel fragments across a killing radius measured in dozens of yards. Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, the battalion's senior mortar section leader, had visited Mitchell's position at 0600 hours to review the fire mission and check crew readiness. Kowalski was a veteran of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, a professional soldier who understood mortars the way some men understood music or mathematics. He had studied the terrain through binoculars, calculating dead space where rounds might fail to achieve proper detonation, and adjusted Mitchell's firing data to compensate for the coral's irregular surface that could deflect fragments unpredictably. The technical challenge lay not simply in firing rapidly, but in maintaining accuracy while doing so. Each round's trajectory was affected by propellant temperature, barrel wear, and minute variations in the base plate's seeding that occurred as repeated firing drove it deeper into Peleliu's coral soil. Mitchell would need to adjust his aim constantly, compensating for these variables while maintaining a rate of fire that could overwhelm the Japanese positions before they could take cover in their cave systems. Private James Sullivan served as ammunition handler, responsible for preparing rounds and passing them to Vasquez, who would drop them down the barrel in the precise rhythm that sustained fire demanded. The two men had developed a working relationship during weeks of combat, learning to anticipate each other's movements with the unconscious coordination that distinguished veteran crews from inexperienced replacements. A fourth Marine, Private First Class Arthur Wong, served as forward observer, positioned 300 yards ahead in a shell crater that offered clear views of the target area. Wong carried a radio that allowed him to communicate adjustments directly to Mitchell, cutting out the fire direction center and reducing the time between observation and correction from minutes to seconds. This improvised procedure violated standard doctrine, but 3 weeks of combat had taught Mitchell that survival often depended on abandoning peacetime regulations in favor of methods that actually worked under fire. The Japanese had learned to recognize the sound of American mortar fire, taking cover in their caves when they heard the characteristic hollow thump of rounds leaving the tube. This conditioned response gave them precious seconds to seek protection, reducing the effectiveness of harassment fire that should have kept them pinned in their positions. Mitchell's solution was to compress the firing sequence, launching so many rounds so quickly that the enemy would have no time to react before the first shells began detonating among their positions. At 0650 hours, Wong's voice crackled through the radio handset, reporting movement in the Japanese positions that suggested preparation for a counterattack against Marine lines. Mitchell acknowledged the transmission and gave the order to commence firing, watching as Vasquez dropped the first round down the barrel with the practiced motion that became automatic after hundreds of repetitions. The mortar fired with a sharp crack that echoed across Peleliu's coral ridges, the recoil driving the base plate deeper into the soil as the round arced upward and disappeared against the gray dawn sky. Mitchell counted 3 seconds before the distant crump of the explosion indicated impact in the target area, confirmed immediately by Wong's radio report of a direct hit near the largest cave entrance. Vasquez already had the second round ready, dropping it smoothly as Sullivan prepared the third from the ammunition stack. The rhythm established itself naturally, each man performing his assigned task with the efficiency that came from constant practice under conditions where mistakes meant death. The mortar fired again and again, the crew settling into a cadence that pushed beyond training manual specifications into territory that only desperation and experience could reveal. The Japanese response came within 30 seconds as machine gun fire began searching for the source of the mortar rounds. Tracers arcing across the valley in patterns that suggested enemy gunners had identified Mitchell's approximate location. Coral fragments kicked up around the mortar pit as bullets struck nearby. But the crew continued firing with mechanical precision, each round adding to the growing concentration of high explosive destruction falling on Hill 100. At 0653, Mitchell's crew achieved a sustained rate of 30 rounds per minute, a pace that transformed the M1 81mm mortar from a harassment weapon into an instrument of overwhelming firepower that exceeded the capabilities of guns twice its size. The barrel grew hot enough that heat shimmer became visible above the muzzle, while the base plate sank nearly 6 inches into Peleliu's coral as repeated firing compressed the soil beneath. Vasquez's hands moved with rhythmic certainty, dropping rounds at precise intervals that maintained maximum safe firing rate without risking a hang fire that might detonate a round inside the tube. Sullivan worked beside him in perfect synchronization, preparing ammunition and watching for any sign of mechanical failure that would require immediate crew action. The effect on the Japanese positions was immediate and catastrophic. Wong's radio reports became increasingly excited as he described the destruction unfolding across Hill 100. High explosive rounds were detonating every 2 seconds across a front 300 yards wide, creating a rolling barrage that moved systematically through the Japanese defensive network. Cave entrances that had sheltered enemy soldiers for weeks collapsed under direct hits, while open fighting positions simply ceased to exist as overlapping fragmentation patterns scoured the coral ridges clean of anything above ground level. The concentration of firepower exceeded anything the Japanese garrison had experienced during 3 weeks of American attacks. Colonel Nakagawa's defensive plan had anticipated naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, and conventional artillery, but not the possibility of sustained mortar fire delivered at rates that transformed indirect weapons into area saturation systems. His troops had survived previous bombardments by retreating into their cave networks, waiting out the storm of steel, and emerging to man their positions when American infantry advanced. But Mitchell's barrage offered no pause, no interval where defenders could assess damage or reposition their weapons. Lieutenant Kenji Matsuda commanded the Japanese company defending Hill 100 from a command post located 30 feet underground, connected to forward positions through communication trenches that had required 2 months of labor to excavate from solid coral. At 0655, his telephone connection to the front-line positions went dead as a mortar round scored a direct hit on the trench entrance, burying 3 soldiers and severing the wire that linked his command post to the riflemen facing the American advance. Matsuda ordered a runner to the surface to assess the situation, a young private named Takeshi Yamada, who had arrived on Peleliu just 2 weeks earlier as part of the final reinforcement convoy that had managed to evade American naval patrols. Yamada climbed the steep tunnel that led from the command post to a concealed observation position, emerging into a landscape transformed by high explosive destruction that exceeded anything described in his military training. The coral ridges that had bristled with fighting positions now resembled the surface of the moon, cratered and smoking, with fragments of equipment and worse things scattered across the broken ground. Mortar rounds continued to fall with mechanical regularity, each detonation adding to the destruction that had already rendered most defensive positions untenable. Yamada watched as she round land directly on a machine gun nest that had survived 3 previous American assaults, the explosion lifting the Type 92 machine gun 15 feet into the air before it crashed back down in pieces. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders equaled the physical destruction. Soldiers who had endured naval bombardment and aerial attacks with stoic determination found themselves facing firepower delivered with a precision and persistence that seemed impossible from weapons as simple as mortars. The sustained rate of fire suggested unlimited American ammunition supplies, reinforcing the growing awareness among Nakagawa's troops that they faced an enemy whose industrial capacity made prolonged resistance ultimately futile. Private Yamada retreated to the command post and reported what he had witnessed, his voice shaking despite efforts to maintain military composure. Matsuda listened to the account and understood that his defensive position had become a death trap rather than the fortress it had been designed to be. Traditional Japanese military doctrine demanded resistance to the last man, but Matsuda possessed enough tactical sense to recognize when such sacrifice served no strategic purpose. Mitchell's crew maintained their devastating rate of fire for 7 minutes, expending 210 rounds in a sustained barrage that consumed nearly half the battalion's reserve ammunition. The barrel had heated to temperatures that made the metal glow visibly in the early morning light, while the base plate had sunk nearly 8 inches into Peleliu's coral soil, requiring constant traverse adjustments to maintain accuracy on target. At 0657, the mortar tube developed a hairline crack near the muzzle, a stress fracture caused by thermal expansion beyond design specifications. Sergeant Kowalski, monitoring the fire mission from a nearby observation post, spotted the defect through his binoculars and immediately ordered Mitchell to cease fire before the barrel failed catastrophically. The sudden silence seemed louder than the gunfire had been, broken only by the distant sounds of secondary explosions as Japanese ammunition stores detonated from the heat and fragmentation of the barrage. Marine infantry began their advance at 0700 hours, moving across ground that had been swept clean of effective resistance. The lead platoon encountered sporadic rifle fire from survivors who had sheltered in the deepest caves, but the organized defensive network that had stopped previous attacks had been shattered by 7 minutes of concentrated mortar fire that achieved effects comparable to a full artillery battalion. Lieutenant James Patterson led his rifle platoon through the shattered Japanese positions, noting details that would later appear in his after-action report. Fighting positions that had required direct hits from tank guns to destroy had been collapsed by repeated mortar strikes, their coral reinforcements, pulverized by high explosive rounds that had fallen with mathematical precision. Enemy dead numbered in the dozens, many killed not by direct hits but by the overwhelming fragmentation that had scoured every exposed surface. The few Japanese soldiers taken prisoner exhibited symptoms that Marine medical personnel recognized as combat fatigue, thousand-yard stares, and trembling hands that indicated psychological trauma beyond normal battlefield stress. Corporal Richard Hayes, who spoke functional Japanese from pre-war missionary work in Osaka, conducted preliminary interrogations that revealed the psychological impact of facing firepower that exceeded human capacity to resist or comprehend. One prisoner, a sergeant who had fought in China and throughout the Pacific, described the mortar barrage as worse than anything experienced at Nomonhan against Soviet forces or during the Philippine campaign. The sustained rate of fire had created acoustic effects that amplified the sound of explosions inside the cave systems, while the continuous impacts prevented any possibility of organized response or tactical countermeasures. His unit had simply ceased to function as a military organization, fragmenting into isolated groups focused entirely on personal survival rather than collective defense. American casualties during the assault totaled 3 Marines wounded, none seriously, representing a tactical exchange ratio that reflected the devastating effectiveness of Mitchell's innovation. The battalion commander authorized immediate production of detailed reports documenting the techniques and results, recognizing that sustained high-rate mortar fire represented a tactical breakthrough with applications throughout the Pacific theater. The technical analysis conducted by ordnance specialists revealed why Mitchell's crew had achieved rates of fire that exceeded standard doctrine by nearly 70%. The key factor was crew coordination developed through weeks of continuous combat operations, where every movement had been refined to eliminate wasted motion and maximize efficiency. Sullivan's ammunition preparation allowed Vasquez to maintain a steady rhythm without pausing to check fuses or adjust charges, while Mitchell's fire direction eliminated the delays inherent in conventional fire control procedures. The damaged mortar tube was shipped back to ordnance depots in Hawaii for metallurgical analysis that would inform future manufacturing specifications. Engineers discovered that the barrel had been operating at temperatures approaching 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, well beyond the design parameters established during peacetime testing. The stress fracture had developed along a weld seam that represented a weak point in the manufacturing process, suggesting modifications that could improve reliability during sustained fire operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese defensive doctrine throughout the Palau Islands began adapting to the threat posed by high-rate mortar fire within days of the Hill 100 engagement. Intelligence reports intercepted by Marine cryptographers revealed discussions among enemy commanders about dispersing defensive positions to reduce vulnerability to concentrated bombardment, while engineering units received orders to deepen cave systems and improve overhead protection against indirect fire. Colonel Nakagawa's headquarters issued tactical bulletins describing American mortar capabilities and recommending countermeasures that included aggressive patrolling to locate mortar positions and immediate suppressive fire when American tubes were detected. These adaptations reflected growing Japanese awareness that their defensive advantages had been neutralized by American tactical innovations that transformed simple weapons into instruments of overwhelming firepower. The psychological effects extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to broader questions about the sustainability of Japanese resistance against American industrial and technological superiority. Prisoners interrogated during the weeks following the Hill 100 engagement spoke of declining morale among troops who increasingly questioned whether spiritual determination could overcome material disadvantages that seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing week. Sergeant Kowalski incorporated Mitchell's techniques into training programs for replacement mortar crews arriving on Peleliu throughout November and December of 1944. The instruction emphasized crew coordination and ammunition handling procedures that could sustain high firing rates without compromising safety or accuracy. Veteran crews demonstrated the techniques under simulated combat conditions, showing new Marines how to achieve rates of fire that peacetime instructors had considered impossible. The tactical doctrine emerging from these lessons influenced Marine Corps training throughout the Pacific Theater. Artillery schools at Camp Pendleton and Quantico began teaching sustained fire techniques as standard procedures rather than emergency expedients, while ammunition supply chains adapted to support consumption rates that exceeded pre-war planning assumptions by substantial margins. Production of 81mm mortar rounds increased dramatically during early 1945, as Pacific commanders requested additional supplies for upcoming operations in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Manufacturing facilities in the United States expanded capacity specifically to meet demand for high explosive ammunition, with quality control procedures ensuring that each round met specifications for weight, fuse reliability, and propellant consistency. Private Vasquez received a Bronze Star for his role in the Hill 100 engagement, the citation noting his technical proficiency and courage under fire. The decoration seemed inadequate recognition for innovations that had fundamentally altered mortar employment doctrine, but Vasquez accepted it without comment, understanding that his contribution was measured not in medals, but in the lives of Marines who would benefit from the tactical lessons learned on Peleliu's coral ridges. The long-term impact on Japanese defensive psychology became apparent during subsequent battles across the Pacific. Enemy commanders displayed increasing reluctance to concentrate forces in defensive positions vulnerable to American indirect fire, instead dispersing their troops in ways that reduced tactical effectiveness while offering better protection against the devastating barrages that had shattered organized resistance on Peleliu. American intelligence analysts studying this evolution recognized that sustained mortar fire had achieved psychological effects extending far beyond immediate battlefield results. The knowledge that simple tube artillery could deliver overwhelming firepower undermined Japanese confidence in their prepared defenses, forcing adaptations that made their positions easier for conventional infantry attacks to reduce through direct assault. Medical personnel treating wounded Japanese soldiers noted trauma patterns consistent with exposure to sustained bombardment, including hearing damage from acoustic overpressure and psychological symptoms resembling shell shock. These clinical observations contributed to emerging understanding of combat stress and its effects on military performance, though the specific relationship between firepower intensity and psychological breakdown remained poorly understood for decades following the war. Mitchell's mortar crew continued operations on Peleliu until the island was declared secured on November 27, 1944, having participated in 43 fire missions that consumed over 1,500 rounds of high explosive ammunition. The crew's combat record documented the evolution from standard indirect fire procedures to the high-intensity saturation techniques that had proven devastatingly effective against Japanese defensive positions. The M1 81mm mortar that Mitchell's crew had pushed beyond its design specifications was retired from service after Peleliu and shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for engineering analysis. Ordnance specialists conducted tests that revealed metal fatigue throughout the barrel assembly and stress damage to the base plate that would have caused catastrophic failure within another 100 rounds of sustained fire. The technical lessons learned from Mitchell's crew influenced the design of the M29 mortar that entered production in late 1945, incorporating heavier barrel walls and improved baseplate construction that could withstand the stresses of sustained high-rate fire. Engineers redesigned the bipod assembly to provide better stability during rapid-fire operations, while the sight mechanism received improvements that allowed faster traverse adjustments between rounds. These modifications reflected the broader pattern of American weapons development during World War II, where frontline experience drove continuous refinement of equipment and procedures. The willingness to modify established doctrine based on combat results gave American forces significant advantages over enemies bound by rigid tactical systems that resisted innovation even when circumstances demanded change. The strategic implications of high-rate mortar fire extended beyond the Pacific theater to influence American military thinking throughout the Cold War period. The demonstration that sustained indirect fire could achieve effects comparable to much heavier artillery systems at a fraction of the logistical cost shaped doctrine for conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent proxy wars, where American forces faced enemies employing defensive tactics similar to Japanese methods. Corporal Mitchell returned to San Diego in March of 1945, carrying with him the Navy Cross awarded for tactical innovations that had saved countless Marine lives during the Peleliu campaign. The citation mentioned specific fire missions and casualty ratios, but made no reference to the broader doctrinal revolution his crew had initiated through desperate improvisation under combat conditions. Mitchell accepted a position at the Marine Corps Mortar School at Camp Lejeune, where he spent the remainder of his military career training new generations of mortar crews in techniques that had been developed on Peleliu's coral ridges. His instruction emphasized crew coordination and sustained fire procedures, teaching young Marines that weapons limitations existed primarily in peacetime manuals rather than combat reality. Private Vasquez survived the war and returned to his family's farm in New Mexico, using the GI Bill to attend agricultural college and eventually becoming a county extension agent. He spoke rarely of his combat service, uncomfortable with the recognition his Bronze Star represented when so many others had died on Pacific islands whose names most Americans could not locate on a map. The technical skills learned operating mortars under fire translated poorly to civilian life, though the discipline and attention to detail served him well in pursuits far removed from warfare. Japanese military historians writing after the war identified the American mastery of indirect fire as a critical factor in their defensive failures throughout the Pacific Island campaigns. The ability to deliver overwhelming firepower from weapons as simple as mortars represented industrial and tactical superiority that no amount of spiritual determination could overcome, forcing adaptations that ultimately proved insufficient against enemies who could innovate faster than Japanese commanders could respond. Colonel Nakagawa died in his command post on Peleliu during the final days of organized resistance, leading troops who had been reduced from a garrison of 10,000 to fewer than 300 effective fighters. His final messages to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo acknowledged that American firepower had rendered traditional defensive tactics obsolete, recommending fundamental changes to Japanese military doctrine that would never be implemented before the war's conclusion. The cave systems on Peleliu that had sheltered Japanese defenders from conventional bombardment remained visible for decades after the battle. Their entrances collapsed by direct mortar hits and their interiors filled with the debris of a defensive network that had been systematically destroyed by sustained indirect fire. Military historians studying the battlefield in later years noted the concentration of impact craters around Japanese positions, physical evidence of firepower density that exceeded anything achieved in previous island campaigns. Private Sullivan completed his military service in December of 1945, having participated in the Okinawa campaign where his mortar crew employed the high-rate fire techniques developed on Peleliu. His loading speed and reliability under fire earned commendations from 3 different battalion commanders, though Sullivan considered his role unremarkable compared to the riflemen who fought at close quarters with an enemy that refused surrender, even when defeat became inevitable. The ammunition consumption rates documented during the Peleliu campaign influenced post-war logistics planning throughout the American military establishment. Supply officers recognized that future conflicts would require stockpiles far exceeding peacetime estimates, while transportation capabilities needed expansion to support delivery of ammunition to forward positions at rates that sustained combat operations demanded. Manufacturing facilities that had produced mortar rounds during the war transitioned to peacetime production schedules, but maintained tooling and expertise necessary to resume high-rate output if international situations required. This industrial readiness represented lessons learned from World War II's production challenges, when demand frequently exceeded supply and shortages limited tactical options available to field commanders. Private Wong survived his tour as forward observer and returned to his family's restaurant in San Francisco, where he worked for 40 years without mentioning his role in directing the fire missions that had shattered Japanese defensive positions across Peleliu. The mathematical precision required for accurate fire adjustment translated well to bookkeeping and inventory management, skills that served him throughout a civilian career far removed from the coral ridges where he had learned to calculate corrections under enemy fire. The tactical revolution represented by sustained mortar fire influenced weapon development programs throughout the 1950s and 60s as American military planners sought to maximize firepower while minimizing logistical burdens. The success of simple tube artillery operated by well-trained crews proved that sophisticated technology was often less important than tactical innovation and the willingness to push equipment beyond conservative peacetime specifications. Sergeant Kowalski remained in the Marine Corps after the war, eventually retiring as a master gunnery sergeant in 1962 after 24 years of service that included combat in Korea and advisory duties in Vietnam. His career spanned the evolution of American indirect fire doctrine from the improvisations of World War II to the sophisticated fire control systems of the Cold War era, though he maintained that the fundamental principles learned on Peleliu remained more important than any technological advancement. The National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico preserves examples of the M1 81mm mortar alongside training materials that document the weapon's employment during Pacific Island campaigns. Educational displays explain the technical specifications and tactical applications, though few visitors understand the significance of sustained fire rates that transformed defensive calculations throughout the theater. Japanese survivors of the Peleliu campaign who lived to write memoirs describe the American mortar barrages as the most terrifying aspect of combat against forces that seemed to possess unlimited ammunition and the industrial capacity to sustain firepower indefinitely. The psychological impact of facing such material superiority undermined traditional military values, emphasizing spiritual strength, creating cognitive dissonance that persisted long after physical wounds had healed. Lieutenant Matsuda survived the Hill 100 engagement and withdrew with the remnants of his company to deeper cave positions in the Umabrogol Mountains, where he continued fighting until late November when starvation and wounds forced his surrender. His interrogation provided American intelligence with detailed insights into Japanese defensive thinking and the psychological effects of sustained mortar fire on troops who had been conditioned to believe that determination could overcome any material disadvantage. The technical reports documenting Mitchell's fire missions circulated throughout the Marine Corps during early 1945, studied by artillery officers planning operations against Japanese home islands that would never be executed due to Japan's surrender in August. The lessons learned on Peleliu influenced assault plans for Kyushu and Honshu, with mortar ammunition allocations increased substantially based on consumption rates documented during successful fire missions in the Palau Islands. Production records preserved at the Rock Island Arsenal show that American factories manufactured over 14 million 81mm mortar rounds during World War II, representing industrial capacity that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated when calculating their nation's ability to sustain prolonged conflict against Western powers. The sheer volume of ammunition available to American forces allowed tactical innovations that would have been impossible for enemies constrained by limited industrial output. The legacy of high-rate mortar fire extended beyond immediate military applications to influence American strategic thinking about the relationship between industrial capacity and battlefield effectiveness. The demonstration that simple weapons could achieve overwhelming results when supported by adequate logistics reinforced doctrinal emphasis on supply chain management and ammunition stockpiling that characterized American military planning throughout the Cold War period. Captain Patterson, who had led the infantry assault across Hill 100, returned to civilian life as a high school teacher in Pennsylvania, using combat experiences to illustrate lessons about leadership and decision-making under pressure. He maintained correspondence with Mitchell for decades after the war, their letters discussing tactics and techniques that had saved Marine lives during some of the Pacific War's most brutal fighting. The mortar crews that followed Mitchell's example on Iwo Jima and Okinawa achieved similar results through sustained fire techniques that had been refined into standard operating procedures. Casualty ratios continued to favor American forces as Japanese defenders found themselves unable to counter firepower delivered with precision and persistence that made prepared positions untenable regardless of natural or artificial protection. Medical research conducted during the 1950s using data collected from Pacific combat operations revealed correlations between firepower intensity and psychological breakdown that informed evolving understanding of combat stress disorders. The specific effects of sustained bombardment on human psychology remained subjects of study for decades, contributing to treatments for veterans suffering from what would eventually be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder. The evolution of American mortar doctrine from peacetime conservatism to combat pragmatism reflected broader cultural attributes that gave American forces advantages over enemies bound by rigid hierarchical systems resistant to innovation from below. The willingness to empower junior leaders to modify tactics based on battlefield results created adaptive military organizations capable of outmaneuvering opponents who possessed superior initial training and indoctrination. Mitchell's crew achieved effects that artillery battalions would have struggled to duplicate, demonstrating that tactical innovation and crew proficiency could multiply weapon effectiveness far beyond specifications established by peacetime engineering. Analysis. The lesson that human factors often mattered more than technical specifications influenced American military training throughout subsequent decades, emphasizing crew coordination and initiative over rigid adherence to doctrine. The Japanese military establishment's failure to adapt quickly enough to American tactical innovations represented a broader pattern of institutional rigidity that contributed to their defeat despite advantages in training, fighting spirit, and defensive preparation. The emphasis on spiritual factors over material considerations prevented realistic assessment of enemy capabilities that might have led to more effective countermeasures against weapons like high-rate mortar fire. Private Yamada, the young Japanese soldier who had witnessed the destruction of Hill 100, survived the war and eventually wrote memoirs describing his experiences on Peleliu. His account emphasized the psychological impact of facing enemies who seemed to possess unlimited resources and the industrial capacity to sustain operations that exhausted Japanese defenders through sheer attrition. The book contributed to post-war Japanese understanding of why their military forces had failed against American material superiority. The coral ridges of Peleliu remained scarred by mortar fire for decades after the battle, their surfaces cratered and broken by high explosive rounds that had fallen with mathematical precision during 7 minutes that changed the tactical balance of Pacific warfare. Visitors to the island in later years walked among these physical remnants of firepower that had shattered defensive networks and broken the will of soldiers who had believed themselves prepared for any test. The strategic lessons learned from mortar employment on Peleliu influenced American planning for conflicts throughout the 20th century, from Korea's frozen hills to Vietnam's jungles to the deserts of Southwest Asia. The fundamental principle that sustained indirect fire could achieve effects disproportionate to weapon size remained valid across diverse tactical environments, proving that innovations developed during World War II retained relevance long after the original circumstances that inspired them had passed into history. Corporal Mitchell died in 1987 at age 66. His obituary in the San Diego Union Tribune noting his Navy Cross and his contributions to Marine Corps mortar doctrine, without detailing the specific innovations that had saved countless lives during the Pacific War. His legacy lived on in training manuals and tactical procedures that continued teaching Marines to push weapons beyond conservative peacetime limitations when combat circumstances demanded maximum effectiveness. The M1 81mm mortar remained in American inventory until the 1980s, serving in conflicts across 5 decades and proving the enduring value of simple, reliable weapons operated by well-trained crews. Thousands of rounds fired in anger from Korea to Vietnam to Grenada traced their tactical lineage to techniques developed on Peleliu's coral ridges by desperate men who discovered that survival often depended on innovations that peacetime planners had never imagined. The final accounting of the Peleliu campaign revealed that American forces had expended over 500,000 mortar rounds, reducing Japanese defensive positions that had been designed to withstand conventional bombardment. The sheer volume of firepower delivered by simple tube artillery exceeded anything Japanese planners had anticipated, contributing to defensive collapses that allowed American forces to secure the island at costs lower than pre-invasion estimates had predicted. The psychological warfare value of sustained mortar fire became recognized doctrine during the Korean War, where American forces used similar techniques against Chinese and North Korean positions with devastating effectiveness. The knowledge that even heavily fortified positions could be saturated with high explosive rounds undermined enemy morale and forced tactical adaptations that reduced their defensive capabilities. In the end, it was not superior courage or spiritual determination that decided the struggle for Peleliu and the Pacific Islands beyond, but the ability to deliver overwhelming firepower through weapons as simple as mortars operated by crews who understood that innovation often mattered more than specifications. The 7 minutes when Mitchell's crew achieved 30 rounds per minute represented more than tactical success. They demonstrated the triumph of American industrial capacity and tactical flexibility over defensive systems that had seemed impregnable until confronted by firepower that exceeded all reasonable expectations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.